define what I understand for reconciliation as an individual and as a social process that is desirable for Cubans everywhere. Psychology describes the process of reconciliation as one that involves forgiveness of self and others, embracing one's history, and being free from resentments that hinder one's capacity to accept and respect others in spite of differences. Personal reconciliation is a building block for social reconciliation. Social reconciliation is about embracing plurality. It is the ability of people in a society to work together for the common good, from different fields, from different projects that redound in a common purpose. It is not necessarily reaching a harmonious unity. Social reconciliation can coexist with ideological diversity as long as no one is excluded from participating in the common task. Reconciliation has been a priority for the Cuban Church for quite some time. The document of the Encuentro Nacional Eclesial Cubano, known as ENEC, the Father has mentioned several times, which in 1986 signaled the re-emergence of the Church in Cuba, stressed the importance of dialogue to address differences and how reconciliation is the goal of dialogue. In 1993, the pastoral letter of the Catholic bishops of Cuba, El Amor Todo Lo Espera, recognized the need to promote love to heal the wounds inflicted by hatred, and it acknowledged the need for reconciliation with Cubans in the diaspora. Once again, it pointed to dialogue as the only way to find new ways to solve the problems of Cuba in the midst of a plurality of perspectives. In 1996, the second national encounter, the bishops made a call to reconciliation and peace. They pointed out that the dialogue among Cubans, for it to be fruitful, rapprochement was not enough. Rather, healing of the profound wounds that marked the national, personal, and family history had to take place. In addition, they said that the road of reconciliation involves the active participation of all Cubans within and outside the country as the only possible opportunity for the future of the Cuban nation. As one can see, although often misunderstood, reconciliation for the bishops of Cuba is not about reconciling ideas or seeking agreement on political views, but reconciling persons in a human, relational way. More recently, in their latest pastoral letter, published 2 years ago, La Esperanza no defrauda, the bishops boldly stated the need for a new political order where diversity and pluralism of ideas could be respected in and through dialogue. They also lamented the fragmentation of the Cuban family and the loss of moral, familial, and social values. Although this document never used the word reconciliation, it called for social reconciliation in terms of respect and recognition of different views. It also addressed personal reconciliation to repair what has been called the anthropological damage that affects Cuban society today. In addition to what the Church has said, it is important to note what has been done to promote reconciliation among Cubans in the island and between Cubans there and in the diaspora. I would like to mention just a few experiences. The Church in Cuba has been creating spaces of dialogue and exchange to build capacity for pluralism of ideas in the search of common good. To this purpose, it organizes programs such as La Semana Social, which addresses themes of Catholic social teaching, and other programs where they discuss issues of history and culture with participants from opposite ends of the ideological spectrum. Church-sponsored magazines are also forums where a variety of views are respectfully discussed. One of the most important gestures of the Church in the promotion of reconciliation has been to open its doors to all people. In the late 80s, people began to lose fear of being persecuted for attending church, and so many people returned to church or went to church for the first time. Some of them were known to have participated in actions that hurt others or even hurt the church. The church received them, the community welcomed them without asking any questions. Reconciliation is also promoted through the charitable works of the church to serve the most vulnerable population, regardless of their political views, and without asking what they believe, or if they believe at all. The church instills the values of love, forgiveness, and reconciliation in different ways through its preaching and formation programs, some of which are specifically directed to this goal. For example, the schools of forgiveness and reconciliation, known as ESPERE, Escuelas de Perdón Reconciliación. These operate in many dioceses. This program, originally from Colombia, was brought to Cuba by the Jesuits after seeing the positive results it had there. Also, in many places we have the ministry of listening, where people share their sufferings and struggle with a trained counselor or religious person. These are people who would not go to confession, but need someone to listen to them. In 1997, the Catholic Conference of Catholic Bishops in Cuba and the Archdiocese of Miami began a program to foster communion between Cuban clergy in the island and in exile. A few years later, the program was open to lay leaders and religious. In this yearly meeting, select Catholic Cubans from the island traveled to the United States to meet with their counterparts, who come not only from Miami, but from different parts of the United States, Puerto Rico, and Venezuela. The purpose of these meetings is to exchange pastoral experiences and learnings to better serve the Cuban people. This process continues to this day, and sometimes has been confused with the Comunión that Bibi Hidalgo will tell you more about. In Miami, the celebrations of Our Lady of Charity, the ministry of the Ermita, and the work of CACED, Comunidades de Reflexión Eclesial Cubana en la Diaspora, and other programs have helped the Cuban exiles to continue their connection with the homeland. In a very small scale, also the circles of reconciliation formed in the Hialeah area helped overcome the differences among the different ways of exile. What can be done in the future to foster personal and social reconciliation? I would like to suggest a few ideas. First of all, it is very difficult to invoke reconciliation when the suffering-causing conditions persist. The conditions that generate conflict or division, usually direct and indirect forms of oppression, exclusion, and injustice, need to be named and addressed. But most importantly, new practices and policies need to be promoted by both church leaders and civil society. The transformation needed is a long-term process. But there are things that can be done in the meantime. Cubans on the island and in the diaspora can rise above dualistic polarities that make them see those who disagree with them as enemies. Dialogue is not possible with an intolerant and self-righteous attitude. We need to foster a language of reconciliation. We need to advocate for non-violent discourse. The official discourse in Cuba and in some spheres of the exile continues to be filled with disqualifying messages towards those who think different. The church needs to continue promoting spaces and programs that promote inner reconciliation to help people come to terms with their wounds, the ones they suffered and the ones they caused, because none of us are all innocent. The church can be a catalyst in the process of healing historical hurts through a faith-filled reading of the past and the present, oriented towards the future. The Year of Mercy, designated by Pope Francis, offers a prime opportunity to promote reconciliation as the experience of receiving and offering God's mercy. One way for exiles to come to terms with the past and build memories is through visits to the island. Some people do not feel safe returning to Cuba, Others are afraid of what they will find. We need to promote these opportunities through pilgrimages, church gatherings, and cultural exchanges. These opportunities also restore the relationship between those in exile and in the island. Reconnection is a key ingredient to the healing processes. We cannot allow the past to dictate our future, but we cannot ignore it. However, the emphasis of reconciliation work needs to be forward-looking, not backward-looking. What we can do together in spite of differences for the future of Cuba. One way of promoting reconciliation is by fostering a spirit of solidarity and service that gives priority to charity over politics on one hand and to profit on the other, with an emphasis on helping those in greater need, especially the sick and the elderly in Cuba. Reconciliation happens in those who give and in those who receive. By doing this, the Church will be serving as a bridge between the peoples of Cuba and Cubans outside the island, as a bridge over troubled waters, over the troubled waters of the Florida Straits. Thank you.
I want to say thank you to Jorge and Paola and Florida International University for hosting us today, and for all of you for joining the symposium. I also have my parents here, so I'm very happy to see them in the audience, as well as my brother Patrick, who is also very instrumental in the work that I'm going to be talking about. I also want to briefly note that it's quite an inspiration to have Padre José Conrado here with us, as well as Dagoberto Valdés, who I know was just sitting there a moment ago. Both actually really inspired us in the work that we did back in the early 2000s, as well as the entire process of INEC, which was truly groundbreaking. So, what is En Comunión? This is a question I've been getting a lot lately, and to be quite honest, at the time that we worked on the initiative, which was from 2002 to 2004, it wasn't something that we were shouting from the rooftops. It was a very internal effort through which many incredible church leaders here in Miami were engaged, including Sister Chiqui, Ondina Menocal, several pastors. Father María just sent me a text message right before coming here saying, I can't make it, but I'm going to pray for you right now. And he was played a very key role. For me as let me take a step back for a moment. For me as a second generation Cuban American, it was life-changing when Pope John Paul II announced in 1997 that he was going to be going to Cuba. My older brother Manny and I, Manny is a proud graduate of FIU and Master's in Latin American Studies, and he and I had been engaging for years around the issue of Cuba. Both of us living in Washington at the time, but we had grown up here in Miami. And we were kind of at a loss at that point as to what could be done. And when the Pope made the announcement, it struck me that it created an opening. It was a temporary opening here in Miami for people to really talk honestly about our relationship on the level of people to people, not with the government, but as Cuban Americans in Miami with Cubans on the island. And I recall there was even one couple in particular that published opposing op-ed pieces in the Miami Herald, which prior to 1997 was I think pretty much unheard of in terms of our approach toward Cuba. So it was then that I decided to enter a master's program and write my thesis on how the church and the Archdiocese of Miami could, in particular, could play a very critical role going forward in bridging the divide between both communities. And Bishop Wenski in particular was a real inspiration, and I had a chance to work closely with him during the whole process of writing the thesis. And it was after that that he introduced me to Archbishop Favalora, and in 2002 he commissioned me to help facilitate a process. So en Comunión, what I can say was a result of really dedication, fortitude and leadership of church leaders here in Miami. My role was just as a facilitator, and my brother Patrick, who worked with me, together we took it very seriously that we wanted the outcomes to really reflect the intentions and goals and desires of the church leadership in Miami. Now, for context, this was when I had the conversation with the Archbishop, this was just a little bit over a year after the Elian crisis. And so it was really a difficult time in terms of thinking about what are the next steps. And the focus of this effort was to get a range of perspectives. And we were very determined that the participants were really reflective of all sides of the spectrum when it comes to Cuba. And in the process, we developed basically a vision and mission statement reflecting all the range of perspectives. And it was very careful in terms of, first, one-on-ones. We had 40 one-on-one interviews, again inspired by the process of ANEC. When Padre Conrado mentioned, casa a casa, pueblo a pueblo, we saw it as one by one. Let's talk with church leaders here in Miami. First, to hear their story, something that Sister Chiqui mentioned to me previously, the narrative, because we all have such strong narratives of our experience, those who were born in Cuba and as well as Cuban Americans. But then to talk about what we'd like to see happen going forward. After the one-on-ones, we had small group sessions where they began to draft mission and vision statements, and then finally a plenary session. I learned the hard way that you can't start with a plenary session in Miami. So we had to build up to that. And it was one of the most remarkable experiences of a lifetime at that point to see all the different drafts come together in one vision. So I'm going to read that briefly to you and then talk about some potential next steps. The mission and vision statement was, En Comunión is a process led by the Catholic Church in Miami that provides a sacred space through which a communion of values builds toward a fraternal re-encounter between the Cuban community in Miami, the Catholic Church in Cuba, and the Cuban people. And so there were 5 key points. 1 was recognize the situation of all Cubans. 2 is overcome our fears. 3, seek a broader encounter. 4, develop a pastoral reception. And 5, promote humanitarian support. I'm just going to read through 1 and 2. And 2 in particular really struck me. Again, giving context to the time, which was in 2002 when we started the process. Create, 1, recognize the situation of all Cubans. Create a sacred space through which we can recognize our personal pain and understand with empathy and respect the significance of the exile experience and the suffering of the people of Cuba. Taking into account the different forms of suffering of all Cuban people as a result of this process, and without comparisons, come to an understanding from a faith perspective of the reality of this experience, looking at its aspects of redemption, which are a call to mission. The second, overcome our fears, they started with a quote from Pope John Paul II. You are and should be the protagonists of your own personal and national history. And this, accept the challenge of our role as protagonists, seeking to overcome the obstacles that prevent us from freely taking public positions according to our conscience. By means of the church as a safe space, appreciating the dignity of others, recognizing political pluralism in Miami, and affirming the right to disagree. And this was a lot of the basis of the work, was really to create that space. Sister Cheeky said something I thought that was really important. She said, disqualifying messages with those who think differently. And that's often been a challenge for us when it comes to the Cuban dilemma that we face. When people are disqualified, it makes it very hard to have a constructive dialogue. And so the focus basically of Comunión was to create that space, beginning with the church leadership within Miami, so that together and collaboratively they can go forward and work toward reconciliation between both communities. And as she mentioned, at the time, the exchanges were going on between the church in Cuba and Miami, so this was a backdrop to that. So I'm going to transition now to December 17th, the date that has changed a lot of things. I had the opportunity actually to go to the flag-raising ceremony with a delegation from the State Department. And this was just a matter of a few weeks ago, and it came very unexpectedly. And I called my mom, and I said, I don't know if I can pull this off. You know, the expense, the childcare, you know, everything. It was quite a challenge. And I was struck that here she was, somebody in our family that had been through, in particular, quite a lot of turmoil, because at the age of 17, on the day of the Bay of Pigs invasion, they came to her house and took her and her two sisters and my grandfather, and she was held captive for 38 days. Thankfully, it wasn't longer, and my grandfather was released after 3 months. But this was certainly an incredibly life-changing event for my mother, especially at such a young age. And she said to me, when we were talking about the ceremony, she said, you have to go. She's going to make me emotional. She said, you have to go because it is my country and you are my daughter. So, where does this leave us now in terms of the recent changes? What struck me in particular during my time in Cuba, I ended up spending 9 days there, just before the ceremony and then afterwards. And I decided I would try to spend as much time as possible talking with owners of cuenta propistas. And I mean, even in my brief interaction with the Cardinal, he also mentioned how there's so much that can be done in terms of economic advancement. And I've been thinking about that a lot in the context of reconciliation. What does that mean between both communities? And it occurred to me that in many ways, the conversation that's taking place in Miami, what Sister Cheeky was talking about in terms of the social and personal reconciliation is just as important as ever. But there's also an opportunity to look at it from an economic perspective and really leveraging the incredible wealth of talent on both sides of the Florida Straits. In Cuba, I would say, and I'm looking at Dagoberto, but you know, it is one of the most entrepreneurial countries in the world. This is how many people survive, and coming up with creative ways to live on a daily basis. And in Miami, we have some of the most successful business owners in the country, within the Cuban American community. So what could be the role of the church in bringing together the talent from the perspective of reconciliation in terms of the social, the personal, but also the economic, because that will lay a really critical foundation going forward for both communities. The more that we can do in terms of thinking of economic advancement and how to leverage this wealth of talent, I think the more progress that we're going to see, and even in a shorter amount of time. I talked with a business owner on my last night there, and I went and visited several other businesses in La Habana Vieja. And this one owner said to me, I want to show you the plans for my ice cream shop. Incredibly, beautiful ice cream shop. He's an electrical engineer, and in Cuba, you're not allowed to start a business in your own profession. So if you're an engineer, you're an architect, you're a lawyer, you cannot start a firm in any of those fields. So he's starting an ice cream shop. And he said to me, he was very excited. The plans were beautiful, and with melting ice cream on the rooftop. I wish I had a picture of it. But he said to me, do you know where I can get air conditioners wholesale? Because that's what I want to start next. There's such a great need for selling air conditioners on the island. And if you know of anybody who can help with just finding wholesale air conditioners, let me know. So I said, oh wow, I have no idea, but I'll come back to that in a moment. But it occurred to me that to the extent that the church can play a role in facilitating conversation around economic empowerment, that will go quite a long way toward bridging the divide. And some of the things that I've heard that are needed are insight, of course, wholesale goods, as I mentioned, access to capital, and training. And my understanding is Cuba Study Group is doing that to some extent with almost like a pilot with a few businesses. The question is what can be done leveraging the incredible resources and infrastructure that the church has, both here in Miami as well as to some extent in Cuba. And in Cuba, I understand that they were having talleres called Emprende, Cuba Emprende, helping business owners with training. So it's something that they already have been thinking about there. But that is one of the main questions that I want to leave this group with today is, to what extent can the church play that role in really economic advancement of the community, but not in a paternalistic way, but rather in leveraging the strengths on both sides. In Cuba, knowledge of the bureaucracy and how to deal with it, and the entrepreneurial spirit, and then in Miami, the success of many business owners and the insights that they have to share in potential training opportunities. And this is something actually with the recent changes that, as my understanding, is allowed, that there can be direct engagement with the private sector. One of the head of CNN in Havana also mentioned to me that if it's even possible for the U.S. government to create particular exceptions for the Cuban American community in engaging with cuenta propistas, that would even be more valuable, which I think could actually be quite significant. So I kept thinking, and as I was thinking about this, I kept thinking about how Pedro Pan left an indelible mark on the community, and of course ENEC in Cuba, in terms of reviving the church. Sister Chiqui mentioned the role of Cresced, and Ondina's here, and Archbishop Roman was a key part of that, and the church-to-church dialogue since the Pope's visit. I don't know what something like this could be called as far as focusing on the economic aspect. I was thinking a lot this weekend about how Airbnb has started in Cuba, and they said they've grown faster in Cuba than anywhere else in the world, I think over 1,000. families have joined. So whether or not this could be something like an En Comunión 2.0, or one thought is to call it Airbnb, if they, Airbnb allows that. But to think in those terms, I think, would really create that space for further reconciliation from an economic standpoint. And if you know anybody who sells wholesale air conditioners, let me know. Thank you.
Bueno, buenas tardes. Voy a hablar en español. Sí, pensé que iba a ser más fácil comunicarme con ustedes en español. Agradezco mucho a Jorge Duani, mi colega y compañero, de todo este esfuerzo que ha hecho de poner en pie este simposio, y a todos ustedes por estar aquí. Yo no sé mucho qué estaba pensando cuando le propuse este tema a Jorge, pero bueno. Creo que ha sido porque realmente yo soy uruguaya, viví muchos años en Colombia, entonces conozco Santiago. Muchas veces conversando con amigos y estudiantes cubanos, me he identificado mucho sobre ese tema de sufrir la dictadura. Entonces creo que es desde ese punto común que pensé este tema. Creo que en realidad no se pueden sacar lecciones. Lo que pasa es que como uno aquí está siempre en Spanglish, en inglés muchas veces, y sobre todo con la influencia de los politólogos, estamos siempre sacando lecciones. Yo no creo que hay lecciones para sacar, pero sí creo que hay algunas reflexiones sobre el modus operandi de la Iglesia frente a regímenes autoritarios que han menoscabado de manera grave la dignidad humana. Por supuesto, no desconozco las diferencias de modelos y de propuestas políticas y económicas, y mucho menos entro a comparar los grados de autoritarismo y violación de los derechos humanos, que no tienen ningún interés en eso, sino simplemente reflexiono a partir de la experiencia histórica, buscando entender las grandes líneas de las acciones institucionales y las divergencias de posiciones entre los miembros de la misma Iglesia frente a estos regímenes. Evidentemente el tema también da para un libro entero, pero bueno, voy a tratar de resumir muy rápidamente para que ustedes entiendan cómo los contextos y las realidades son distintas, aunque podríamos buscar algunos puntos en común. En el caso argentino pesó mucho la fuerte dependencia, incluso económica, de la Iglesia argentina con relación al Estado. Seguía primando la mentalidad establecida por el patronato colonial, que la evangelización no depende de poderla practicar en libertad, sino de la existencia de una estructura estatal que la protegiese. Esta doctrina fue fortalecida por el nacionalcatolicismo, que consideraba que el catolicismo forma parte inherente de la nacionalidad